Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. In fact, I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, it's always great to be back alongside you here, virtually at least.
Wonderful to be back alongside you, Eugene, as always.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be back with all of our viewers. We've hit some milestones recently. We're now over 200,000 followers here on YouTube. So shout out to everybody who may be new to the show. We've actually gotten tens of thousands of followers in just the last few weeks. I think a lot of it related to the fact that we've been, there it is, covering critical important issues.
I have to.
As we always do. Yeah, please don't.
Well, also, Eugene,
please.
There's another milestone that we're
there?
trying to hit. Yes, a very important one, which is very exciting for us. It looks like we have exactly at this point 998 patrons for the Breakthrough News Patreon. But you know what would be even better than 998, Eugene?
What's that?
1,000. 1,000.
Good round number.
It's a nice round number. The zeros are there. You guys, help us make it to 1,000 patrons. Go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron. And not only do you get to help support all of our, what I think is really important programming here at Breakthrough News that brings you the news that you're not getting from not just mainstream media outlets, but unfortunately, like a lot of just outlets in general neglect a lot of the coverage I think that we do a really fantastic job providing, especially, I mean, one of the reasons we've gained so many followers in the last few weeks is because we've been really consistent about covering Africa. And right now, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in the show, there is, as you've called it, Eugene, a social explosion in West Africa. It's an incredibly important continent that deserves attention, and we give it attention because of how important it is. Point being, one of the reasons we've gained so many followers is because we've been consistent in that, and people are looking for really good news and analysis on that issue. If you enjoy and support that kind of news and analysis, become a patron of Breakthrough News and help us reach over 1,000. Go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. And then also you get access to exclusive content, including, Eugene, you just did a seminar, your monthly seminar on Africa.
I'm getting ready to do one next Tuesday.
Oh, sorry, next Tuesday. Why did I think it was this week?
Well,
I'm a terrible
I don't know. Either way, it's next Tuesday at 1 p.m.
I did not come prepared. I thought it already happened that I missed it.
Wow.
Anyways, it's very sad. You guys become a patron of Breakthrough News so Rania can get her schedule together. But also you can access exclusive content like Eugene's upcoming. I think this will be one of the most important episodes that you've done. Seminars on Africa, which you do monthly, as well as you can access the second half of my show Dispatches, which of course, like the first half is always free. Second half is available to members of Breakthrough News. So I reiterate, become a patron of Breakthrough News. Help us get over that 1,000 patron hump and access exclusive content. And then also cool merch. Eugene, do you have the merch? I should have asked
just
first. Okay.
Give me 1 second.
Thank goodness. Okay. Thank you. There's
you go. There's actually more than this. There's shirts. There's all sorts of things that we have. We actually have a whole new store. If you're already a patron and just want to get, swagged out on Breakthrough News gear, you can find it all if you go to our website at breakthroughnews.org, including the link to patreon.com/breakthroughnews, where you can become a patron. So we've got a lot of fantastic stuff like Rania Khalek's Dispatches, my seminar, which I guess is fantastic. You tell me.
Which I thought already happened.
You guys. Thank you. Mugs. The whole nine. And even more coming. The more patronage we receive, the more we can do, the more we can cover, the more places we can go directly, the more opportunities we have to work with other journalists on the ground in many different countries across the world. So really, it actually is making a huge, huge difference. I said this the other day. If everybody who followed us on X, the platform formerly known as Twitter, all gave us $5 a month, it would be actually over $5 million a year, right? So it seems small, $5 a month, but actually when we come together collectively, it can turn into millions of dollars a lot easier than you think. So 5 for 5 million sounds pretty good to me. So whether it's big, whether it's small, whether it's $1,000, $100, or $5, all of it really matters to us. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. And while you're at it, maybe tweet out that you have supported us, post on Instagram, do a TikTok, whatever you need to do. Say, I have just become a patron of Breakthrough News. It's really worth it. And if you want to know how worth it is, they're live right now on YouTube at their YouTube page, youtube.com/breakthrough news, with the Freedom Side, where we're going to have a fantastic slate of guests, as we always do here, moving from Latin America to the BRICS Summit, to just unbelievably shocking report about immigrant detention that NPR recently released here in the United States. We'll be talking about Niger for sure, the 50th anniversary of hip hop, and much more here on the show. So sound the alarm, ring the bell, as it were, and let people know that we're here. Make sure you subscribe and make sure you hit the bell so you can get the alerts to everything we have here on YouTube. Rania, yes.
I have one more thing. Yes, of course. I have to berate our audience before we get started, which I do throughout the show. I love that we've got over 300 people watching, because I think the topics tonight are really popular ones and important ones. However, I noticed only 122 of you have pressed the like button. So the other, I don't do math well. Eugene can fix it on there. The other over 150 who have not liked yet, press that like button. It boosts us in the YouTube algorithm and brings into more people's feeds so that more people can get access to the very important guests that we're about to have on the really important and covered topics that we're about to cover. So
Indeed.
Like the show, you guys.
There it is. There it is. Also a plea for public education in America here.
Jesus Christ. Yeah.
Your first choice college, Virginia Tech, good math school. On that note, we are going to get right into it here.
Not engaging.
There are actually a lot of electoral things happening in Latin America right now, one of which was the primary campaign in the country of Argentina that just took place in the past couple days. There was a bit of a shock in terms of the person who got the most votes came out on top. They have kind of an interesting style of primary there in Argentina. And we'll get into all of that and more with our fantastic guest, great friend of the show, Zoe Alexandra, who is the co-editor of People's Dispatch, one of my favorite websites. Zoe, thank you so much for being back with us.
So glad to be here.
Well, we are really glad to have you. I think maybe some people have probably seen maybe a little bit about what happened in Argentina, since it was surprising. It's actually made it into the U.S. and Western press. But obviously there was a shock when someone from outside the two major parties who has a very colorful platform. So maybe just explain, what took place, but also maybe just a little bit of how this is structured, because it's different than the way we think of primaries in the U.S. In terms of how their electoral system works.
Definitely. So on last Sunday, it was the PASO elections. These are essentially, what we would call primary elections. And above all, it's a bit of a temperature check in some senses, to get a sense of where people are voting, to get a sense of, for example, the coalitions that are going to go to the elections together. Again, something that doesn't happen in a two-party system like the United States, where you, in Argentina, you have a lot of parties, and a lot of parties make electoral coalitions. They come together, bring the support from all these different parties, and then they have to decide, okay, well, who actually gets to run as candidates in the election. So there were a lot of different electoral coalitions that were using the PASO election to define who would be the presidential candidates. And then also for all of the people who want to run candidates for their own party, they have to break a certain threshold to be able to actually go into the general election. So that's sort of the basic functioning of what they call a PASO election. And in these PASOs, it was very, very shocking, as you said, Eugene, because the person who got the highest vote share, which is, again, it's not really the winner because it's not elections where someone wins. The person who got the highest vote share was a far-right libertarian candidate, Javier Milei. And we'll get back to him and everything that he represents later. But then the ruling coalition Frente de Todos, who is currently being led by Alberto Fernandez, he had already announced that he wouldn't be running for election this year, which again, it's not very common for an incumbent president to not run for re-election, but I think that speaks to the level of the political and economic crisis that Argentina is facing. He has such low approval ratings that he decided not to run again. And in that coalition, which has been rebranded because it is such a for whatever reason, a failing brand, it has been rebranded Together for the Homeland. And they elected Sergio Massa, who's the current Minister of Economy, and he won out over social leader Juan Graboy. And then for Together for Change, which is the coalition that Mauricio Macri used to be part of, his former Minister of Security, Patricia Bullrich, who's extremely hardline. She's not, as far right and as maybe crazy as Javier Milei, but she's quite firm on security. She was popularly criticized for being the author behind a lot of the very, very intense state repression that took place during the Mauricio Macri government, and of course the infamous disappearance and assassination of Sergio Maldonado during protests in Argentina's southern Patagonia region, which really shook the country at that time. So that's a bit of the overview of these electoral, not exactly results, but kind of results in the PASO elections.
I'm curious, Zoe, if you can talk a bit more about this particular guy, Javier Milei, if I'm saying it right, that you mentioned, in the sense that obviously he's been described at least by U.S. media as like a Donald Trump-esque figure, and that sort of like far right, like milieu or whatever. But I mean, a lot of it's also been described as this is like a response to discontent with the establishment, which I think is like very much in keeping with the pattern that we've seen in many countries around the world in the last several years. And you do see the rise of these far right figures sort of coming in and like obviously taking up a big chunk of that popular discontent. But that leads to a question about what's the state of the left in Argentina? Because also in moments like this, when the establishment is quite unpopular, it does give an opening to the left. So where is the left in Argentina? Is it being repressed? Are there any candidates that represent it? And why is this far right Donald Trump-esque / libertarian guy picking up all of the, I guess, excitement or antagonism towards the establishment rather than the left?
So, yeah, Javier, I'll start with the Javier Milei question because I think it's something that's on many people's minds to kind of understand who is this controversial figure. And I think, yes, he is part of this Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro wave, but he also has his particularities because it's especially given the context of Argentina, just for people to remember that it's been just over 40 years that Argentina was able to win back its democracy, defeat the military dictatorship, and rebuild the country in a lot of ways. And since then, in these 40 years, Argentina has really been known as a country that struggles extremely hard in defense of human rights, that has built social organizations that are some of the strongest across the continent. This is a country where, all sectors of society are organized and mobilized. You go to any protest in Argentina, it's going to be one of the biggest ones you've ever seen. And in that context, a figure like Javier Milei, this is why he is a shock, because it's a country that people always look to as, they have all these human rights defenders. They have this very strong legacy of really fighting against the military dictatorship, defending democracy, being a bastion of internationalism. And then you have someone like Javier Milei who says, we're going to criminalize abortion. We're going to essentially burn the central bank or dissolve the central bank. We're going to get rid of all of, a ton of government ministries. We're going to ban sexual education in schools. We're going to completely dollarize the economy. I mean, these are ridiculous proposals for so many reasons, but especially in this context of a country that really has been a beacon in a lot of senses for social struggles, for struggles of rights and the defense of rights. It's a country where you have complete access to higher education. Any person, it's for free. You don't even have to take an entrance exam. And so Milei is a complete trying to basically attack all of these rights. He said in his campaign speech a number of things which stood out. One of them was that he said there's a slogan in Argentina that where there is a need, a right is born. And so when there's a need in the population, like a need for education, a need for healthcare, that becomes a right. And he said it's no longer where there's a need, there's a right, because that right has to be paid for. So he has this complete vision of just whoever is able to pay, they deserve that. It's not a right, it's a privilege. Another thing he said was that we're going to end kirchnerismo and we're going to end the political caste. And I think that's where a lot of people are seeing this connection with the Donald Trump-esque character, with this whole thing. We're going to drain the swamp. We're going to go against all these political elites. And I think that his appeal is less so about his proposals. I genuinely don't think that 30% of people are actually in agreement with all of these different proposals. The dollarization of the economy would completely destroy Argentina's economy. Nobody wants that. But he is different. And Mauricio Macri and his ruling coalition of Together for Change completely destroyed Argentina by taking out billion-dollar loans with IMF and completely plunging the country into a state of economic insecurity, raising the poverty rate to 40% during his mandate. There was a 500% devaluation of the currency under Mauricio Macri. Alberto Fernandez came into office and he didn't have the political weight to actually push forward structural changes, to confront the IMF, to say we're not going to pay the debt, which is what the mass sections of the population were demanding. They said, we can't pay another debt. This debt does not correspond to us. And unfortunately, the Peronista center-left coalition did not have enough weight behind them or political will. It's unclear what really happened there, but they were faced with a situation of economic devastation. They were faced with the pandemic, and they were unable to really change and fundamentally change the situation of millions of Argentinians. It's still a country where you have the highest level of economic insecurity in the region, where inflation was 100% last year, and where the currency is so unstable that you don't know the next day Rania, this is something you know in Lebanon, that if the next day if your money is going to be worth anything, if your salary is actually going to give you food to eat. I mean, that impact is so big. So I think that, of course, we have to be worried about what it means that people are voting for Milei. But I think this context and the economic situation cannot be underestimated.
No, I think that's a very important point. I mean, to some degree, it feels like, Argentina is still living in the shadow of the 2001 debt default and never come out from under it. Paul Singer, a huge donor to the Republican Party in America, of course, was one of the people who Macri mortgaged the country off to. But that's another story for another day. Any indication from Milei of, how he may act in terms of sort of geopolitics, regional politics? I mean, obviously, Argentina's grown a little bit closer to China, which seems to have some bipartisan elements to it as well. But obviously, we know Bolsonaro, when he came into Brazil, was a hard pivot away. Does Milei seem like that kind of person? Or perhaps, given the dire straits of the economy and his libertarian views, may he be perhaps a little bit more open to some of the new alliances that have been forged by Fernandez?
Well, I think one indication is the dollarization of the economy. That certainly says something about the position and the orientation you want the country to be in. He has said that regarding the IMF debt, again, this is, an economic orientation, but of course denotes a certain geopolitical orientation. He says that the IMF debt, they're going to repay it and even implement harsher measures on the population. So I think all of this could suggest he's actually already reportedly had meetings with IMF. It could suggest a more similar orientation to Mauricio Macri. We know, however, that under Alberto Fernandez, there have been very, very significant talks with China. They have done currency swaps. They've actually signed a lot of major agreements for projects that will be underway. What does that mean if Argentina under Milei? Unsure. But I think that his orientation domestically is definitely what he's been focused more on, and largely.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zoe, as always, really appreciate you joining us. And I also have to mention, you're not only the co-editor of People's Dispatch, but you were the co-host with our very next guest of Give the People What They Want, which airs every Friday morning on the People's Dispatch YouTube and I believe also Facebook pages. So definitely check that out. Zoe, Vijay, and Prashant with you. But as always, Zoe Alexandra, co-editor of People's Dispatch, thanks so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mm-hmm.
We love Zoe.
We do. And People's Dispatch, fantastic. Truly one of the best sources if you want to keep up with what's going on around the world, which is difficult to do. Somehow they produce a huge amount of articles every single day about every corner of the globe. And I'm not lying. You'll notice that if you check them out.
Absolutely. No, their stuff is so appreciated. I will say they are one of the best outlets to get information about all kinds of things that the mainstream ignores, including various conferences is not the right word, but like various meetings. I'm trying to do a segue and I'm failing terribly.
Yeah, why don't you just let me go ahead and introduce the next guest?
I'll let you
I see what you're saying. They are indeed talking about that. The BRICS Summit is soon to be upon us in the next few days. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and it will be in South Africa this year. A lot been happening with the BRICS, of course, and perhaps maybe more relevant, the BRICS Summit than it's ever been before, given the geopolitical ructions we are seeing here now. And to discuss this, we are very, very honored to be joined here by Vijay Prashad, who is the director of the Tricontinental Institute. And I have to note here, they just released their new newspaper that, very convenient for us, has the title, "The BRICS Have Changed the Balance of Forces, but they will not by themselves change the world." It's their 33rd newsletter, so go to tricontinental.org and check that out. Vijay, thanks for being with us.
I thought we were going to talk about the 50th anniversary of hip hop.
Well, listen, if you want to give me your top 5 hip hop albums, I'm ready to take them now.
I mean, Vijay, are you ready for this? Like, do you really want to go there? We can.
I was the only one amongst all of you who was born already when hip hop was born. So there's that. It's been a soundtrack for most of my life, except the first 6 years. So there's that.
Vijay.
Well, listen, we will get your best albums. We'll do an all music show. If you don't know, Vijay is a great connoisseur of great music. Maybe they'll have some great music at the BRICS Summit. I really don't know. But that being said, obviously there's a lot swirling around this summit. Putin not attending in person. Everything happening with Ukraine, China-India relations. So there's so many different elements to this. I guess my first question for you, Vijay, is, what is the significance of the BRICS Summit this year? Is it just looming larger because of the news, or is it really more significant?
Well, it's the 15th BRICS Summit. Let's not forget that the BRICS grouping came together when the detritus of the Western banking system looked like it was going to collapse the world economy. And really, that was the motivation for these 5 large countries of the global South and Russia to get together, start having discussions about South-South cooperation, particularly in trade. I don't want to oversell the BRICS project because essentially it starts out as a trade alliance, as a way to deal with development, financing, mutual trade, and so on. It then takes on a political role, but the political role is really secondary. I really don't want to oversell the BRICS. I know there's a lot of conversation about it. Now, this year, it's significant for both reasons of peace on the one side and development on the other. Both reasons. Why both reasons? Well, after the BRICS was formed in 2009, and about 3-4 years later, things started to deteriorate for the alliance, largely because you saw a long-term lawfare campaign against the government of Dilma Rousseff, and then, the arrest of Lula, who had been the president before Dilma, the arrival of the right-wing Temer and Bolsonaro in Brazil. So Brazil began to walk away from the BRICS project a little bit. India in 2013 elected a right-wing government, still there, Mr. Modi. The Indians began to walk away a little from BRICS. But it became clear because BRICS is principally a trade, commerce, to some extent development alliance, that despite their political disagreements, there was a lot that held them in common. And that's why BRICS continued to meet, and that's why they discussed and then created two important institutions: the new development bank, also called the BRICS Bank, and the contingency reserve arrangement, which was supposed to be an alternative to the International Monetary Fund. The contingency reserve agreement really hasn't gone forward, but the BRICS Bank has been established. The current director, in fact, is Dilma Rousseff, former president of Brazil. So, for the first thing, in terms of why the BRICS was able to stick together, the development and trade issue held it together. But this year, they are in the thick of debating the question of Ukraine, the Cold War in China, and so on. Lula is back. Lula is really back with a bang. He's up there in the world stage saying, let's talk about important issues. So they're going to discuss the politics, the peace question in particular, but also the development issue. The International Monetary Fund has returned after the pandemic. Harsh development agenda they've placed before a lot of poor countries. China has put a lot of money into circulation for development, produced a kind of alternative. The BRICS Bank also there as an alternative. So yeah, it's going to be an important summit. Some problems which we can talk about, but it's going to be an important summit, both for development and trade, the anchors of the BRICS project, but also for peace.
Vijay, just there's a few things that you said that I'd like for you to elaborate on. And I do think it's important. This is also happening in the context of over a year and a half after Russia's war in Ukraine. And it's kind of like made BRICS a bigger talking point in the mainstream media in the US, at least. And one thing I noticed just kind of perusing the coverage that it's receiving before the fact now is there's been a lot of attention in the corporate mainstream press in the US and in the UK on this, like, they're trying to make, I think, a bigger fight about it than it actually is, about the idea of, there's like an internal debate inside the BRICS countries about who to accept, right? Because you do have a lot of countries across the global south applying for, to be a part of BRICS. Many, in fact. And also there's a little bit of disagreement about how many countries or who should be let in. And like I mentioned, a lot of like outlets like AP, Reuters, The Economist are kind of making this a bigger deal than maybe it actually is, or maybe it is a big deal. I don't know. But what's your sense of how important this discussion is? Because there are so many countries, including ones that are closely aligned with the US, who are actively trying to join this organization.
Well, look, the world is filled with contradictions, and I think that's how we need to understand things. Most important is that many, many countries, poorer countries, developing countries, some rich countries like Saudi Arabia, many countries see the BRICS as significant. I mean, the fact that they are lining up to join BRICS, I don't want to get into the details. I mean, one of the countries is Argentina. You just had a segment on Argentina with my colleague Zoe. Argentina might have a far-right government next. I don't think the Brazilians will be particularly happy to have Argentina as a full-fledged member of BRICS with that kind of government. On the other hand, because BRICS is anchored in a trade and development agenda, even a far-right government is going to have to deal with the BRICS countries. Look, whatever they might say, the largest trading partner of Argentina is China. You can't get out of that. Australia, Japan, largest trading partner, China, they both joined the regional agreement with China called RCEP. That's the reason why countries that might have some political disagreement with this or that BRICS country nonetheless want to be in on the action. I think that's the first thing. It's not about who's going to enter. The fact is, lots of countries are lining up because they know the BRICS bloc is significant. But let's also shift focus for a second. BRICS is going to take place in South Africa. Currently, major developments taking place in the Sahel region in Africa. These coups in 4 countries against France. Major sentiment, anti-imperialist sentiment, you could call it. Maybe it's just anti-French sentiment, but it could expand and develop. Well, it's not necessarily, because we're not seeing, for instance, in Agadez, protests against the US drone base, Airbase 201. It's been largely anti-French kind of protests. The French have got to go. I'd like to see somebody say, well, let the Yank base also go. So far, we haven't seen that. But this new mood is there across the African continent. And this is going to play in the BRICS Summit. It's not possible for the people coming to South Africa not to have to engage with a new mood that is sweeping across the continents of Africa, Asia, Latin America. There's a new feeling in the air. And I think this is going to actually, in a way, radicalize the politics of the BRICS. Look, it's not a question of who joins. Already the BRICS is not a coherent political body. There's a right-wing government in India, and then there's the government of the center-left, say, in Brazil. But they have come together to build something together, despite their political disagreements. And I, for one, think there's something productive here. It's a little bit like a mini version of the United Nations. 193 countries belong in the UN. But you know that the UN system has had its power seized by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. Russia, China, also members of BRICS, but France, Britain, and the United States. There are no Latin Americans who have a permanent seat in the UN Security Council. No African country has a permanent seat in the Security Council. And part of the reason, in my opinion, for the emergence of the BRICS is that the door was closed by the permanent members of the Security Council to expansion of the permanent seats there. Brazil has long wanted a seat. South Africa has long wanted a seat. India has long wanted a seat. These are the 3 other countries in BRICS that are outside the permanent structure of the UN. You've got to see it in that perspective. They have national interests which seem to be converging despite political disagreements.
No, very well taken points, especially about Niger. I've actually already seen the anonymous sources from the Elysee Palace leaking to the media that the U.S. is abandoning France to try to save their own bases. Interesting thing to look at. But speaking of war and peace issues, obviously one of the issues hanging over this is the war in Ukraine. It's in South Africa, the BRICS Summit, where, of course, South Africa is helping to lead the African Peace Initiative that Russia has been, at least a little bit more than lukewarm towards. Brazil obviously been raising the issue of peace very aggressively, and then India and China at least on the record in favor of it. Putin, of course, will not be there in person, but is in close contact with all the leaders of all the countries, it seems. So at the end of the day, are you expecting there to be any potential movement at all on, if not the actuality of peace, at least the narrative of how we could get to more substantive talks?
12 years ago, I wrote an article about how 4 African heads of state, including the president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, were prepared to go to Libya, both to Tripoli to talk to Mr. Gaddafi and to go to Benghazi to talk to, the so-called rebellion leaders, many of them freshly flown in from the Gulf Arab states where they were financial advisors and so on, including Mr. Mahmoud Jibril. But they were blocked. France said you can't take off. In fact, they were treated in a humiliating way. I was interested to see that a few days ago, Mr. Museveni, the president of Uganda, made a public statement reminding the world of how these African heads of state were treated by the West when they tried to enter, to negotiate, not in Europe, not in Asia, but on African soil. And they were given a mandate by the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. I'm bringing this up in order to say that there's a lot of frustration among African countries, Asian and Latin American. And Mr. Museveni is not a radical guy, although I must say when he was a student at the University of Dar es Salaam, Mr. Museveni was a student of Walter Rodney, at the time was a Marxist. No longer, not for decades. He's a man of the right. And yet there he is saying, look, you don't treat us with respect and we can't tolerate this anymore. This is the attitude with which they are going to come to Johannesburg and say, we can have a role in the discussions around Ukraine. This is not an issue only for NATO countries and so on. We must have a role. We are member states of the United Nations. And I think Mr. Museveni's statement about Libya is really in the context of the disregard with which billions of people are treated over their views regarding peace and development on the planet. People want to say, that's about it. Now, what they are saying, debate them, engage them, don't silence them, but they get silenced, and that creates resentment.
Vijay, I'm just curious, like you talked a little bit in the beginning about some of the limits of BRICS, and it sounds familiar to what we've had conversations about on this show and probably other programs on Breakthrough News about the limits of multipolarity. And you talked a little bit about like the fact that there are some contradictions here, right? In terms of the different kinds of ideological makeups of the governments that are involved, where you have like a far right government in India. Obviously, Brazil has changed, but you have definitely a different ideological makeup, even in Russia, right? Like Russia is not the same as, let's say, as China. So all that said, can you talk a little bit about the limits? While BRICS is wonderful, like what are the limits that we should be aware of, especially those of us who do want to see a much different, more socialist world where U.S. empire doesn't control everything?
Well, look, things might be clearer on the peace side. Okay, there might be more general agreement between, say, the Indian Foreign Ministry and the Brazilian Foreign Ministry. They don't want the conflict, as an example, in Ukraine to continue because this has downside effects economically, hunger issues and so on. So on peace, I think there's much more agreement. Let's come to the economy. Here, things are interesting. The contingency reserve arrangement, supposed to be the alternative to the International Monetary Fund, the engine for that hasn't been turned on yet. It's still cold. It's still sitting there. They haven't put it on. The new development bank has been lending, and under Dilma, there are more promises. But I'm yet to see whether these are going to be different from the kind of World Bank projects that we've had. Now, you see, you can have any government you want, Rania, in Brazil or in India, but the question isn't the government. It's the permanent bureaucracy that runs the central banks. In Brazil, Mr. Lula's government is in a tooth and nail struggle with the central bank around interest rates. It's not been easy for the Lula government to have their way, as it were, when it comes to monetary policy. They are playing a rearguard action. In India, the Reserve Bank of India is fairly conservative. In China, it's a communist government. The Communist Party is in power, People's Republic, and so on. But the monetary policy there is very much run on neoliberal lines, in terms of its central banking. Now, if you're going to have an alternative to the IMF, World Bank, you need a non-neoliberal attitude towards money. You need a different attitude towards lending and financing. This is just not in, the facts don't show this. Thus far, the BRICS project is hampered by the control, really, that neoliberals have over economic policy in the BRICS states and in the project at large. Now, lots of moves to change it, to contest it. But I don't want to, walk out of here giving anybody the view that this is some sort of easy administrative decision where somebody just signs a piece of paper and says, now we're going to change policy. This is a huge struggle. It's a struggle within the economics profession in these countries. It's a struggle within their bureaucracies.
Yeah. Very important points, all of which can be gone into, I'm sure, more deeply in the 33rd newsletter from the Tricontinental Institute. The BRICS have changed the balance of forces, but they will not by themselves change the world. You can check that out at tricontinental.org, of which our guest Vijay Prashad is the director of. That's the Tricontinental Institute. Vijay, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, guys.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Wow, I do want to say that. Well, I always love hearing from Vijay. But I also want to add that we have quite a few people watching the live stream tonight, which is fantastic. I see we've got over 1,400. So to those who are watching, I also see only 450 have liked the show. So I mean, look, we've got like 3 times that many, more than 3 times that many. My math is that good. Watching the show, please do hit the like button, you guys. It definitely helps us in the YouTube algorithm that's like built basically against us. So please do like, and also For those who are watching, I highly encourage you to become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news and becoming a patron. Not only does it help support all of the wonderful work that we do here, but you can get access to exclusive content, including exclusive merchandise. So go check that out, patreon.com/breakthrough news. I'm going to throw it back to you, Eugene, because I know we've got more guests coming on.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to shout out Marvin, David, and Kuzba89 for your donations here just below the screen, where you can also donate on YouTube. But we want to turn our attention to, I have to say, is one of the worst things I've read in quite some time. That's NPR just put out a report, the title of which is "The Government's Own Experts Found Barbaric and Negligent Conditions in ICE Detention." Very tough read, but we are very honored to be joined here by Silky Shah, who's the executive director of the Detention Watch Network, to talk more about this. Silky, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you both.
Well, we are really happy to have you, even though what's bringing us here is just, well, I guess it's not unbelievable, but outrageous. For those who haven't seen, I don't even really know how to describe it. I just will read this very quickly. There's an examination of 24 ICE facilities, and they found negligent medical care, unsafe and filthy conditions, racist abuse of detainees, inappropriate pepper spraying of mentally ill detainees, and other problems that in some cases contributed to detainee deaths. Maybe I know the answer to this question, Silky, but I guess my first question for you was, were you surprised by any of what has been revealed in this report?
Sadly, I wasn't actually that surprised by this. I think I've been working on immigrant detention for over 20 years now, and the stories are stories we've heard for years. And I think what is shocking most is how much this administration is ignoring what's happening in immigrant detention right now. So I really appreciated this reporting coming out, really shedding light, showing what we all know, experts seeing the complaints that are happening inside the system, a lot that hasn't been exposed, that has to be forcefully exposed to sort of learn about what's happening, the abysmal conditions. Many people have died in detention over the years. And that's the worst of the system, but people are constantly put into segregation, into solitary confinement. People are constantly, denied medical care. People are sexually abused, physically abused, so much racism within the system, trauma that lives with them, even if they are outside of detention. And, when you look at the scope of the system, you have hundreds and thousands of people who've been subject to detention over the years. And so it's not this narrow thing that's happening. It's actually happening to tens of thousands of people right now. And over the course of the years, even more. So I wasn't surprised, but I think it was important and harrowing to read the level of what came out of these reports. And hopefully it can actually have some attention again on this system that received a lot of attention under the Trump administration, but in many ways, this administration has done a bit, but hasn't done enough to really address what's happening in immigrant detention and start closing down even more detention facilities.
So much of what was in this really, it's shockingly horrific, and we can get into some of the details, but some of what I found interesting was the fact that so much of this just sounds what unfortunately is so typical of the U.S. prison system. So it does seem like this horrific prison system that we have to the U.S. is just being applied to people who are being put in detention for supposedly, whatever, quote unquote, violating immigration laws. Not always, but, we know that the immigration system in the U.S. has become in many ways like a carceral system. I'm just curious what you have to say about that, about the way that the situation around immigration has become an issue of like criminalizing people being able to, come to the U.S. And just by nature, like that exposes people to a system that in the U.S., this is what the criminal justice system unfortunately looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's such an important point. I think a lot of people within immigrant rights movement are alarmed to see what's happening in immigrant detention, but it isn't actually that unique. This is what's happening to the 2 million people who are imprisoned in jails in the whole of the U.S. We see the U.S. as the world's leading incarcerator. And that has been applied to immigration and makes actually the way that immigration operates here unique in that carceral systems are used, and they're used for a lot of different reasons. In the story, they talk about how immigration detention is not meant to be punitive, and rather people are in detention just to await a hearing. You have so many people, hundreds and thousands of people who are in pretrial detention, pretrial jail in the US all the time, not serving a sentence. And that's similar to immigrant detention. It's not. So it's important to recognize the similarities between the systems. They are the same facilities. Many of these jails are county jails. Even the private prisons are usually former prisons, former state prisons or federal prisons that have been used that now immigrant detention is being used for. So immigrant detention is prison and jail. It's the same thing. It's not something unique or different in any way whatsoever. I think one thing that is unique is that people aren't, similar to pretrial detention, people aren't serving a sentence. So they're there indefinitely. Sometimes people will spend 2 weeks in jail in immigrant detention. Sometimes they'll spend years or months, depending on what's happening with their case. And that's really harrowing when you think about these facilities that are meant for short-term stays, no outdoor recreation, no ability to be in touch with loved ones, no ability to have the medical care or needs that you have. And so I do think it is so essential for the immigrant rights movement, for people who care about immigration, to understand that these systems are fully intertwined. They are the same system. The immigrant detention is a part of the prison industrial complex, and our ability to fight back is really reckoning with how the U.S. has become the world's leading incarcerator and uses prisons as a solution to a lot of problems, and has resulted in so many more people being incarcerated and dying in these facilities.
Yeah, no, really, it's, some of the things, someone was found to have HIV. They didn't tell him. There is a pregnant woman. Right. They refused to check if she had an ectopic pregnancy. Someone with an open wound that received no care whatsoever. And when I was reading this, the thing that really struck me is that these reports were secret, that the government commissioned the reports, they got the information, and then, of course, it had to be forced out by journalists. I guess, again, maybe this is a question I should know the answer to, but does that speak to how systemic this sort of mistreatment is? I think a lot of times people hear this sort of thing about prisons and they assume it's like one, sadistic guard doing this terrible thing. But it seems like if you know this is happening across your system and you keep it secret, it's partially maybe because you want it that way. I don't know. Maybe I'm editorializing too much, but your thoughts there.
No, absolutely. It's completely systemic. It's intentional. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, lies, hides information all the time, does everything they can to keep the system going, to sort of juke the stats. So they say, like, keep people in detention, say that they need more people in detention, or need more money for detention because, they're having to release people. The truth is, everybody in immigrant detention is there for administrative procedure. Anybody could be released at any given time. And the choices about who is in detention and who is not are completely arbitrary. And so this administration has a lot of power to release people from these really horrific conditions, but instead they continue to keep the system open and keep many people in these facilities, even when they have very, very many times said that people shouldn't be in these conditions, that people shouldn't be in private detention, but continue to use private detention facilities. And so I think that's absolutely right. It is very systemic. A lot of what is happening here, this actually reminded me of a report that we did under the Obama administration many years ago called Fatal Neglect, where we took information from the Freedom of Information Act request, made a request, learned what was happening in some of these death reports, and saw that there were actually a whole number of negligent deaths that happened in the system that wasn't exposed. And we only got that information through FOIA. And after that, it showed actually similar cases, people not calling 911, not doing an HIV test, not doing the things that people needed that could have actually saved their lives, who were going through with alcohol withdrawal, other things that they needed particular support for, that we know how to do that. We have, effective, we have medical resources that can support people, but instead we choose not to. And so I wasn't surprised by this, but it was alarming to see story after story after story and see what's happening, and to see that the Biden administration isn't doing urgently what needs to be done, which is close down more detention centers.
Well, so I want to ask you a bit more about that, because you mentioned when we opened that, you know, a lot of this was sort of more in the public eye when Trump was president. And now, you know, it is true. People look away more, particularly liberals who did seem to care more about immigration when Trump was president. But obviously, this is a bipartisan problem. Is there any, I mean, okay, so it's great this report came out, but there's been so many reports, right? Like, it's not the first one. Right. It's not the first time that we hear and see documented horrific like stories and lots of evidence of people being sexually assaulted in these facilities, you know, people being just, you know, neglected medically, all of the things that are in this report. Not the first time. It's horrible, but not the first time. So then it becomes an issue of what's to be done. Are there people inside government, inside the Senate, inside the House trying to do something about this? Like, where are our allies in this? What do we do? Like, those of us who care, what do we do? That's my big question. I know you probably don't have the exact answer, but.
Yeah, no, I mean, I will say there, you know, we've taken sort of two approaches to addressing what's happening with the system. One is fighting at the local level. So many of our wins have actually happened in communities that have immigrant detention centers that are fighting for their loved ones. One of the sort of data that we've discovered is that actually when a detention center is in a community, people are more likely to be targeted because, again, it's very arbitrary. So they're saying, oh, we have these 600 beds open. We need to sort of consider who's in the area. How can we make sure to fill those beds? They have guaranteed minimums built into the contracts, meaning they have sort of like quotas where ICE is essentially paying regardless of, you know, what the need is or not, quote unquote, need is or not. And so we know more and more that the existence of detention facilitates and encourages deportation. And we've actively said, okay, let's close down detention centers, stop future expansion. And we've been really successful at the local, state, and federal level in places like New Jersey and Illinois. We've actually been successful at ending detention contracts. The Biden administration has ended 5 detention contracts, and that's because of pressure from advocates, pressure from people who were detained and fought for their lives, from pressure from organizers and loved ones. And so that rising up is so essential. Additionally, we've been really trying hard to reduce the amount of money going to Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, the Department of Homeland Security. So much money. I mean, I think a lot of people think about the post 9/11 era, and a lot of these policies were very much baked in already. As Rania, you mentioned, you know, this is a part of mass incarceration. We saw all these policies and all these laws change in the 80s and 90s, but it was after 9/11 that so much more money was funneled into the system, and that we ended up having this sort of like fortress state model that we have now, where so much money goes to border militarization and the immigrant detention system. And so a lot of our efforts are to try to reduce that amount of money and to say, no, you can't have more money for this system. We have to move away from this. And in terms of our allies, we did see changes. And I know the Biden administration has been very hypocritical on this issue, especially when it comes to the issue of private prisons. But because of our efforts, they did end contracts at a number of facilities. And that's important to keep in mind. They have the power to do that. And we can continue to push them to do that. And there's actually some contracts ending soon, and we're trying to push them in Elizabeth, New Jersey, where there's a private prison. The Biden administration is fighting back to keep that prison, but we're doing a lot to say, actually, no, you shouldn't be doing this. And so I think a lot of what people can do is push their members of Congress to support detention center closure, push their members of Congress to say, we don't want more funding going to Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Customs and Border Protection, and really push for policies. You know, there's a bill in Congress called the New Way Forward Act that actually would repeal a lot of the policies that lead to mandatory detention and criminalization of migration. And we really eventually want to get to that point that we can pass that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Silky, before we let you go, I assume many people who will read reports like this will be moved to action. Where can they find Detention Watch?
Yeah, absolutely. Our website is detentionwatchnetwork.org, and we are also on Twitter, or whatever it's called now, at Detention Watch, and also on Instagram. And so please reach out. We're ready to help and support folks who are trying to fight the system.
Right on. Well, thank you so much, Silky Shah, Executive Director of the Detention Watch Network. Thank you so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I just, it's a horrifying situation. I'm glad we get to cover it. And for those who appreciate that we are covering these topics, please do like the show, because there's over 1,000 of you watching, but only 686 have liked it, and it helps us in the algorithm. And also, sorry, I know I sound like a broken record, but I got to do it. I'm just going to be the one who does it. If you do like our programming here at Breakthrough News, please do become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. We are at 998 right now, trying to get over that 1,000 patron milestone. Help us reach that goal. Become a patron, and not only do you help support Breakthrough News, but also you can access exclusive content and also cool merchandise. So there we have it. That's my spiel.
Lot of reasons why, and of course, most importantly, to help us keep bringing you the stories that you care a lot about. And over 300,000 of you watched Rania Khalek's dispatches on the issue of Niger that came out about a week ago. There was a guest on there you might recognize if you check it out. But now we want to turn again to the issue of Niger quickly, Rania, before we move forward in the show. I mean, in some ways, things are still in a holding pattern there if you really look at what's taking place. I mean, the issue of a potential ECOWAS invasion still on the table. They're meeting today, but there is growing pushback against that, certainly on the African continent in various institutions like the African Union, the civil society level, even in countries like Nigeria, where we've seen the Christian Association of Nigeria, a number of organizations that are in the northern part of the country come out against it. Obviously, countries themselves, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, standing with Niger. So it doesn't really necessarily seem like those countries even are in a great position to launch a conflict. Algeria, of course, also against it, but it's still there because they have put themselves out there in a big way, saying that the coup, so-called coup, military transition must end in Niger. But there are a range of different things that we could see happen. I think it's very important people watch it very, very closely. There's a number of different things that could be said, Rania. I mean, I think the New York Times put out their big article yesterday, and you might be shocked, Rania, you might be shocked. It indulged in quite a few interesting distortions, if you might say, that were designed, I think, to create the perception that what's happening is not what you see happening to my left right now, a social uprising that is taking on various different elements, but that, it's a huge blow to freedom and democracy and the West's efforts to bring freedom and democracy to Niger and the broader African continent.
I gotta say, there's obviously other parts of this that I want to hear your take on, but it just, the level of hand-wringing over the fact that there are people who do support this, and the way it's being framed as, another African country succumbs to authoritarianism because they don't like who the US likes. That's essentially what the New York Times and a lot of these other liberal outlets are saying, is that if Africans are not happy with client or puppet or ally of the US in power, then it's because they're anti-democratic and inherently opposed to freedom. And there's such a racist element to that. That's what they're saying. That is what they are saying. That this is, and to even suggest that and you made this point so many times before, the idea that because somebody was voted for by people in a city at one point, that's the limits of democracy. That's literally the limits of democracy when it comes to global South countries, is if we set up this NGO-based voting apparatus that doesn't address any other civic needs besides voting, and then people turn against it, it's authoritarianism. But specifically, if it's somebody we liked. And now there's somebody in power who's saying mean things about France and mean things about imperialism, therefore anti-democratic and authoritarian. But one thing I want to ask you about, Eugene, is I think there's something quite significant about the fact that the African Union had this meeting, and you have countries explicitly saying that they oppose a military intervention. Very large, important countries across Africa who are no, we're not going to get on board with this ECOWAS notion of like military intervention. Can you explain what happened and the significance of really large countries like Ethiopia, obviously South Africa and others essentially not like refusing to get on board with this? What does it mean about what's happening on the African continent?
Well, I think it means a few things. I mean, some of the countries you just mentioned, like South Africa especially, has a long record, actually, of being against U.S. and other types of interventions on the continent. And the SADC bloc of Southern African countries is sort of known for that, although they now started to back away a little bit from that in Mozambique. Ethiopia, a little bit less so, but similarly. But I think what we're seeing across Africa in relationship to what's happening in Niger is in the context of, the youngest continent, a population of countries that are tired of living in total poverty, marginalization, and dispossession, are looking for there to be significant changes. I think many African leaders are fully aware of the fact that most people don't think those changes are going to come on the back of Western bayonets, and certainly, their own popularity is to some degree at stake. I think that there are a whole range of other issues that are motivating it. I think many African countries, certainly Algeria has made this point, Mali has made this point, are very fearful of what the impact of this was. I mean, certainly the destabilization of Niger, even further than it already is, spilling over into Mali and Burkina Faso at a time where these, I don't know, for lack of a better word, jihadist insurgencies are thriving, could create all sorts of very complicated ISIS-style situations. It will supercharge the issue of immigration. It could potentially lead to significant collapse in other West African nations. You've already seen Benin, others, even in Mali, if you look at where the conflicts that they push further and further out of the sort of Saharan element to the lower parts of the country, central and southern parts of the country. So already you're in a situation where there's a significant expansion of violence and unrest. And that this kind of conflict would actually make it worse, because then you would have the governments of Niger and potentially Mali and Burkina and maybe even Guinea, who have said they were going to stand with Niger, fighting other African countries, and then the people who they're mainly fighting now would obviously take advantage of that and try to establish their own sort of projects. Who knows? Basically, who knows what the spillover effect is going to be? But you can say for sure, immigration, poverty, which is already very bad, income inequality, which is already very bad, the deaths and instability, which is already very bad, would only get worse and worse and worse, and would in fact expand across the West African space into parts of Central Africa, I think reverberate in different ways in other countries in Northern Africa, Libya, Algeria, and others. So I mean, I think many countries are seeing that right now, the possibility of, this spiraling out of control in a way that's hard to even imagine is very high. The balkanization of Africa and it turned into like a warren of insane, killing is there. So it's an interesting thing, because I think the ECOWAS countries that are opposed to Niger are taking, have a different set of concerns. And that set of concerns is they're afraid they could be next. I mean, they themselves have said that they're concerned that after Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, that it could spread to other countries. And I think that's important to note, because, why is this happening? And I think that's something that is being, and this leads to my point about the New York Times, this is something that's being totally washed out. It's just like there's just some random coup by these random military people. But as I pointed out in our discussion last week, as the former finance minister of the now deposed government of Niger said last year in 2022, he said, we're sitting on a social time bomb. Because the country is totally destitute at the bottom of almost all development indicators. You've got 42% of people living on $1.90 or less every single day. You've got 42-ish, 43-ish% of children 5 to 14 are involved in child labor. They're what's known as working children. So, that's basically nearly half of the children in the country over the age of 5 and under 15 are actually working. You've got the unbelievable destruction and poisoning of the earth and the air and the water by the uranium trade, where these French companies could care less about what they are doing. Only 37% of people are literate in the country. There's about 4.5 million, and this number is growing because of the sanctions against Niger, about 4.5 million people, 4.4 million, who cannot survive every day unless they have access to humanitarian aid. They just cannot survive. They would, undoubtedly perish, and are now going to be in a situation that could be akin to famine because of the sanctions that are being leveled on Niger. And then you have the extreme instability of happening in the country. You've got these insurgencies. You've got the fact that since the state is so weak and the social and economic investment is so low, in addition to these, I almost hate to call them jihadists in a way because they're misusing Islam for their own banner. But beyond that, you have a huge array of just bandits, right? Like anybody who can get enough money to get some motorcycles and some weapons, of which there are many because of the destabilization of Libya in 2011 by NATO in and of itself, that you have all these problems that are existing. And this is a country where almost 50% of the country is under the age of 15. So it's a very young country where people like all over the African continent are just fed up and they cannot take it anymore and they want to see a big change. And that's how you can have elements of the military, elements of the political elite, and so on and so forth, then, take their opportunity. I think you look at some of the people like the leader of Burkina Faso, they're obviously motivated to some degree, I think, by, and perhaps more than some degree, by social concerns of wanting to change these conditions. We don't know if that's true of all these people. I think there's a lot of opportunists and others who are just looking to improve their own position. But the only reason why they can take this sort of action is they know it will be supported by the masses of people who are like, yes, we will try anything. I mean, when almost the whole country's living in poverty, people will take almost any opportunity. And that's the final two things I just want to say here before we move to our next guest. First and foremost, this issue of the election and the overthrow of democracy. It's interesting to me that Macky Sall, the current president of Senegal, is one of the biggest supporters of an ECOWAS invasion of Niger. It's a very similar situation to what's happening in the Senegalese elections right now, where he is orchestrating an effort that has banned the number one opposition figure, the most popular person who is the most likely to challenge the Senegalese regime and has also been critical of France. Well, this, much ballyhooed election where Bazoum was elected, and by the way, Bazoum has backed coups in the past in Niger, but, this much ballyhooed election, same situation. The number one opposition person was banned from participating in the election, on the basis of lawfare, essentially very similar to Senegal. And many people felt at the time that, essentially the fix was in because the only person who could have potentially won outside of Bazoum was out of the race. So I don't know how democratic that really is. Large numbers of people couldn't participate because there was obviously a massive terrorist insurgency. People are attacked for going to vote. So the idea that there was some great democratic mandate or something like that, or that Bazoum is some great Democrat, is I think in and of itself problematic. But then the second piece of it is, there's this whole conversation, and the New York Times made a big point about this. Well, violence is down in Niger, and it's because America and France have trained all these excellent troops who are, here. And unlike Mali and Burkina Faso, who have gotten rid of France and are, shock of all shocks, working with Russia, their violence is going up there. And, there's a truth to it, but that's why I thank you so much, Matt, there behind the scenes, very Johnny on the spot, bringing up that graph. So the blue on the left there, or my left, is Niger. Then there's Mali in between. And then on the right is Burkina Faso. Now, as you can see, for pretty much the entirety of this discussion, which goes back, or this graph, a little bit before 2019, Mali and Burkina Faso have had more violence than Niger. So already it was not, it wasn't like they were higher or something than Mali and Burkina Faso and now have gone lower. But it's also worth noting, if you look at the bar graph, that represents the number of incidents. And you look towards the end of the blue and you see a little spike, which comes right over 2023, which is, of course, in 2022, like right now, basically, the time where allegedly, there was all this great training from America and from France that was, taking on these terrorists and taking them down. But the number of incidents was actually going up and spiking at the time. But what did happen is, and thankfully for this, let's point that out, the number of people dying has gone down. And it's harder to see on that graph, but there's a black line, and the black line is also the number of people dying. But you'll also see there's a precipitous drop in the number of people dying in Burkina Faso around the same time you see it in Niger. But the overall number is a lot higher, so you don't necessarily see that, but it's a part of the trend. And you can also see the trends are relatively similar too and how they go up and down. So I just say all that to say, France and the United States have been there since like 2014, building these drone bases. They've had thousands of troops. At one point, France had 5,000 troops there. They've been training people for over 10 years. And so this idea that somehow magically all of a sudden it was France and the United States and the troops with their great training that are turning it around, I think is a huge oversimplification of what's actually happening here. And I think it's designed to create a totally fake narrative that America and Europe are for fighting terrorism and helping democracy. Russia is against it. And so insofar as you see countries breaking with France and talking more with Russia, they're evil authoritarians just like Putin and just like the Russians, and they're being either duped or they themselves are deeply malign, forces, when in fact, these governments that were supported by the US and France for years were not democratic, were constantly manipulating elections. Many of them have been involved in coups themselves at different points over the different years. They have huge numbers of human rights abuses associated with them. They were totally unable to turn around the situation in terms of these insurgencies. And this fake history is now being created on the basis of 6 months in the first part of this year, and a conflict that's been going on for 15 years to try to create a false impression of what's happening and to make it seem, this is the most important thing, to not make it seem like what it really is, which is the combination of a social explosion and a mass uprising of poor working people and peasantry against neocolonialism and abject poverty in alliance with some subset of the military and the elites. They want you to think it's just a purely top-down process being governed by the Wagner Group or something, and that the worst thing that could ever happen for Africa is America and France be kicked out. So there's a lot more to it than that. You can obviously watch what we did there on Dispatches, but it really is, it's just unbelievable to see the level of distortion that's out there on some of these issues. Disgusting, actually.
Well, I feel like it calls for maybe a second episode or another episode to follow up on all this, hopefully very soon. But, for those who haven't seen it, me and Eugene did do an hour-long episode on this very issue last week. After you're done watching this live stream, you can go check it out in the Dispatches playlist of this channel. But no, I mean, it's a really important. It's something very important that's taking place, and I think it speaks to the social explosion you're talking about, as well as like some shifts we're seeing around the globe, but across Africa especially. And it's like kind of a long time coming. And I think I've seen this said in other places is like nobody expected it to come from Niger, but it's like almost like why wouldn't you? Given everything you just described, but no, there's so much more to be said, which is why I do think that we do need to like revisit this and have like a lengthier episode on it. But I think all that matters here is that to watch all of these media outlets like the New York Times throw a temper tantrum essentially because maybe they don't want the US there. And oh no, France. It's like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, gosh.
Calm down, guys.
So much more that can be said. I read a report this morning, although I haven't confirmed it, that some of the troops from Niger, French troops, are going to Chad. Also about to power in a military coup. Cote d'Ivoire, by the way, its president, one of the number one people who wants to invade Niger, also brought to power in a military coup and illegally ran for a third term in the elections just a couple years ago. But democracy, freedom. Anyway, we're going to keep moving forward here on the show. This is the month of August 2023, the 50th anniversary of the art form known as hip hop. So we are very, very honored to be joined by a hip hop scholar and connoisseur herself, Claudia De La Cruz, who among many other superlatives I could list is the co-executive director of the People's Forum. Great location, great place. Claudia, thanks so much for being with us.
It's so great to be with you both. There's nowhere else to be but on the Freedom Fund, especially on Thursdays.
Look at that.
That's a great endorsement. We need to quote that, and that'll just like be one of our testimonials. For the
listen, Claudia is also a theologian, so a testimonial is something she does very well, no doubt. But Claudia, the turn to hip hop, 50th anniversary, born in New York, born in the Bronx. I mean, talk to us about the birth of hip hop, the conditions it emerged from, and I don't know, how does something like this? It's so ubiquitous in our lives now, but of course, it didn't exist before August of 1973, really. So how does something like this, an art form like this, get birthed in a place like the South Bronx?
I mean, I have to say, I'm from the People's Republic of the South Bronx, and that's something that we're very proud of, having given birth to hip hop. But I think one cannot speak about hip hop without speaking about its working class and roots of poverty, because that's exactly where it comes out of. I think speaking about the context is to speak about young people who created this art form out of resourcefulness, who were creative, poor Black and Caribbean young people, Puerto Ricans, Jamaicans, Black Americans, who were neglected by U.S. capitalism. The sons and daughters of immigrants who fled, most of them, economic and political destabilized countries because of U.S. imperialism. Folks that came from the U.S. South because of the levels of exploitation that they experience. So these are the sons and daughters of these folks that are creating this art, and created a culture where young people were attempting to build community, to find ways of surviving violence, surviving poverty, displacement, and the many issues that they were facing in that community at that particular moment. You mentioned that the first jam on August 11th, 1973, was organized by DJ Kool Herc, Jamaican, was at the request of his youngest sister, Cindy Campbell, who was asking to create this jam as a fundraiser to buy school supplies. So there is the class character of hip hop culture. I think it's also important to contextualize it in a larger sense as well. This is post civil rights era, post Black liberation movement. A lot of the leaders had been persecuted, assassinated, imprisoned. We're talking about, a huge global economic crisis that was there during the 1971, 1972, and was felt the hardest 1973. So we were witnessing the baby steps of what we know to be the monstrosity of neoliberalism. People were witnessing and experiencing the loss of school programs, the loss of jobs, the loss of manufacturing jobs in textiles and steel, the disappearance of unionized labor as well. And so the erosion of labor protection, which left a lot of workers more vulnerable to exploitation. It was turmoil. We had Nixon's war on drugs, the increase of surveillance, the beginnings of the prison industrial complex that profits from the dehumanization of people in prison. And so we see all of these economic and political and social realities kind of merge as immigrants from the Caribbean and the people displaced from the South come together in this neighborhood called the South Bronx. And it was kind of like a gumbo, it's a type of sancocho where you have these different cultures that were rooted in Black culture ultimately, the Black Caribbean and folks from the South, Black folks, poor folks. And so gave birth to hip hop as a mixture of, we're talking about the 50th anniversary of hip hop. We should talk about the 50th anniversary of salsa as well, because it was born in the same context. And so these folks were feeding each other. There's a really good film that's called From Mambo to Hip Hop that speaks to the breakdancers and the moves that they use and how that came out of Boogaloo and Mambo. And so there's a mixture of things, and creativity was there, but there was more than that, the sense of needing to survive. The need to survive the actual context that gave birth to hip hop. There's the reality also. A lot of people forget, there was a huge persecution of young people and criminalization of young people as well. There were many street gangs and during that time in the South Bronx as well. And there was a police brutality that was being experienced by folks from Fort Apache, which is the 41st precinct in the South Bronx, and from which a movie was created. There's an actual movie called Fort Apache that tries to, demonize and criminalize Black and brown youth. And so all of these things were happening in that moment. The creation of the Cross Bronx Expressway, that while it connected all the boroughs to be able to profit capitalism and be able to bypass the Bronx, it made a whole community invisible. It made a whole community detached from the rest of the boroughs. And so, the South Bronx continues to be one of the poorest congressional districts in the United States. And that's not by coincidence. It was something that was built.
First I have to say, because Vijay really wants everybody to know that he has a favorite hip hop album, A Tribe Called Quest, People's Instinctive Travels in the Paths of Rhythm.
Okay.
So
Can
everybody
I
knows that is Vijay.
Okay. Yes.
So I guess that's a good way to ask, for those who are watching, who maybe are a bit younger or don't, know the hip hop of the 90s or the early 2000s or even before that, that has that sort of like conscious hip hop style to it. who, throw some names out, Claudia. Like, who should people be going on, and listening to? Some of our younger and maybe even older listeners as well. And on top of that, like, I also think there's an important element here, which is that what you're talking about is something that did challenge power. And we know that whenever anything challenges power, there is an attempt by capital to co-opt it. And we have also seen that happen with hip hop as well. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that element of it. But, it hasn't been completely co-opted. But there has been an attempt, right, to like create a hip hop that is much more materialistic and very different from its roots.
I can't. I'm going to give you the names in a bit, because you and Eugene need to start thinking about your own albums, because I want to hear what your albums are. I know you're ready. We've had this conversation, you and I. But I mean, I think it's important when we think about like the potential of hip hop, and I want to say the potential of hip hop. It's huge. There's a huge potential to be able to take hold of hip hop as a culture of resistance, precisely because of its origins. I want to make a distinction. There's a hip hop culture and there's a rap industry. Those are two different things. The hip hop culture is a lifestyle, I think. I mean, I think that there are many of us who are not necessarily producers of hip hop music, who are not dancers, who are not writers, right? Who are not necessarily engaged in the elements of hip hop, but consider ourselves to be hip hop because we come from the same origins as hip hop. Socially, politically, economically, we experienced a lot of what gave birth to hip hop as well. And so there's a difference. And I want to make that difference because the co-optation comes through the rap industry that was created. And we need to ask ourselves, who created the rap industry to serve what purpose, right? It was not the purpose of those who were seeking or had aspirations of wealth. It was not their purpose. If we think about what hip hop has become in terms of, cultural imperialism and how it has been utilized to be able to sell individualism, consumerism, like we need to be able to come to the realization that hip hop culture, the one that has been co-opted by the rap industry, does not serve poor folks. And most definitely, folks that are represented in the South Bronx today. And so when we think about reclaiming hip hop as a culture of resistance, we need to think about what is hip hop culture. Those of us could consider ourselves hip hop, those folks that are creating projects in the name of hip hop, those that are engaging in, hip hop education or hip hop scholarship. What are those things serving? That's a huge question. What are those things serving? I mean, are they serving to advance the struggles of poor people, of poor Black and brown people? Are they serving to uplift, and provide a certain level of orientation? Is it to inspire and also move people to action? Because ultimately hip hop served that in its moment. And a lot has changed in 50 years. And a lot of co-optation has happened in 50 years. And a lot of misusing hip hop has happened in 50 years. So we could learn from the origins of hip hop and the journey that hip hop has had and be able to kind of like start peeling the layers and saying, we need to get back to hip hop as what it meant in that particular moment. And I think, I had a friend that once told me, hip hop is like the Dead Scrolls. If you go back and you uncover and you like open up the Dead Scrolls from the message, what does the message tell you? It's telling you what was happening in the South Bronx at that particular moment. The sound of the police, you open it up, the police brutality, persecution. What will happen 50 years from now? What will be the hieroglyphics? What will be the Dead Scrolls that young people 50 years from now will open up and read? What is the message that hip hop is giving young people? And I think, it has a lot of potential. Some folks would say hip hop is dead, but I think it's not. I honestly don't think it is dead. I think it's a form that was presented to us to be utilized precisely as a tool of resistance. And so there's a lot that we need to do to be able to reclaim it. There's a lot that we need to do to be able to amplify folks that are doing the labor, the work that hip hop culture has taught us. But there's a lot of questioning that needs to happen in terms of our own positioning as folks that are hip hop in relationship to the political, social, and economic reality of our people. And in terms of the 5 albums, I mean, I got more than 5.
Yeah,
But
that's okay.
but
5
but
in
I'll
no
share.
particular order. I actually hate top 5, 10, and 100 list of albums and movies. But anyway,
I'm not gonna give it to you in order, and I'm glad you said that. But I love Wu-Tang. I'm gonna say that again. I love Wu-Tang. So Wu-Tang Clan's 36 Chambers is one of my favorite. The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill is one of my favorite. Some people will not agree with me, but I'm from the Bronx, and there were a lot of Puerto Ricans involved in the creation of hip hop. So Big Pun,
okay,
Capital Punishment,
of course.
Okay, see, I see your face, so I'm kind of like going. You're my rubric. DMX's It's Dark and Hell is Hot.
Yes.
And I like Star Rock. I don't know if you've heard her, but she's awesome. Star Rock is great, and she has an album that came out in 2021, I believe, that is called The Sharecropper's Daughter, which is pretty awesome. And I did mention folks like Dead Press and other folks, Immortal Technique and other folks, because a lot of folks obviously are very much aware of the work that they do. But in terms of hip hop and like actually expressing the reality of a lot of our folks in the communities and like actually putting out stories and being lyricists, these are my folks. These are the folks that I like to listen to.
That's a good 5 set of albums. I definitely would have DMX's Dark and Hell is Hot on there. That was that 1999, 1998? That was a very formative album for me in many ways. Outkast AT-Aliens album, definitely underrated, but deserves all the flowers in the 50th anniversary of hip hop. Let's say the self-titled KRS-One album, the 1996 one. I definitely love that album. In terms of top to bottom production, Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style, I still feel is like, just production wise from top to bottom, amazingly tight. Let me see. This is why I hate these things. I'll give you a sort of one that's out there. One Rifle Per Family by Bamboo.
Okay, I like Bamboo.
Yes, I think his best album, but I think, again, thinking albums, thinking top to bottom is important. I think that might be 5, but I would also add Ice Cube's Death Certificate because I have always loved that album, and it meant a lot to me when I first bought it. And Plan 9 record store in Charlottesville, Virginia, but that's my that's my few. Although I could list more, but that's my 5-ish, maybe 6. I lost track.
What are you, Rania? What about you?
Well, I didn't come prepared with 5, but I was like a Miseducation of Lauryn Hill fan. Obviously, Public Enemy, Immortal Technique, definitely. I mean, DMX, yes. I don't have specific album titles, but I'm not like a person who knows album titles of anything. Even the things that Eugene makes fun of me for listening to. So I'll just throw that out there. But no, I hope people are hearing these names though and like writing them down, because there also is like a lot of history in this. And it can be like really radicalizing to like hear, songs from the late 90s, early 2000s specifically, like which I kind of, grew up listening to, that have political context to them and have local context to them, that like people can speak to. And one thing I really like that you talked about, Claudia, is you mentioned a lot of like different parts of the world and what you said. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that hip hop, the sort of conscious hip hop from the US, has definitely had an impact around the world. I know for a fact, even in the Middle East, there's a lot of Middle Eastern political artists, Palestinian artists, for example, who learned English listening to that sort of music, learned English, like listening to like Tupac and to like all of these different artists, and then became, artists themselves and sort of tried to do the Arabic version of all of that. And I know it's happened in other parts of the world too. So this is like goes beyond just like inner city sort of poor Black communities in the US, and goes beyond just the US itself and immigrant and indigenous communities, and reaches really across the world. So there's like an anti-imperialist context here as well.
No, I mean, obviously, like hip hop in its origins is internationalist. I mean, it's Caribbean, it's Afro-diasporic. Like, so it touches people all over the world precisely because of its roots. Just like soul did, I think, like funk has, like salsa, like but like all of these culture expressions that are very much rooted in an international community, you know, and it also has made it really easy to be commercialized precisely because of that. It's made it really easy to be, you know, become a commodity precisely because it is an international way of communicating. I think that in the work that I did for a while with folks that are engaged in the hip hop culture, one of the things that connected people were precisely the albums, the songs, the lyrics of folks that were creating creating this type of art form. It's valuable to be able to have that level of connection worldwide. It becomes a disadvantage again when that level of commercialization happens. That benefits again the industries and the folks who own these industries that ultimately are the ones also creating the narrative. And the narrative is always going to be to advance capitalism. And so it becomes a tool for those who are oppressing. It becomes a benefit. It becomes something that they are not willing to let go of. In fact, that they hold and then they control how it's crafted, how it's shaped, how it's amplified. And that's where the problem lies. I think that there is a lot of, again, potential in the hip hop culture if we're able to take it back as a culture of resistance. If we're able to understand and think about it as, you know, part of a legacy that was connected to a certain context. And we have a context today that folks that are creating art need to respond to or need to be engaged in and need to be able to see what is their position and what changes, what interventions, what contributions they could make to be able to advance the struggles of the people and the communities that they're coming out of.
Well taken points on many, many different levels. And I think that there's so much to dig into here. I know that you were actually able to teach a class, Claudia, that got a lot deeper into all of this. I think it's available on YouTube somewhere. I wish I would have looked it up there, but just search Claudia De La Cruz hip hop. I'm sure you'll find it somehow, some way. I also will just say this, since we're talking about albums, Functified by the Brat. One of the most underrated albums.
I like it.
Chicago, let's go. You know what I'm saying? What a deeply underrated album.
I have to say, if we're going to go into I love Nas' Illmatic. Like after that, we could talk about what has happened. But Illmatic is legendary.
Oh, of course. Of course. Okay. One of the great intros
also,
of all.
Yeah. One of the greatest.
Listen, and you know, Nas is kind of, look, after that album, he couldn't find a good beat for like 25 years, but, you know, he's come back around.
I mean, he gave his best, I think, right there. You know, I think, yeah.
You never know. There's so many connections, you know. I mentioned that KRS-One album, you know, and if you listen to it, if anyone listens to it, it's called KRS from '96, you hear Busta Rhymes not rapping, but he's just all over the album. So he was just in the studio. And I was like, wow, what was going on? And I looked, and it was like 3 months before he released his first album, which was obviously fantastic and in many ways changed the game. And even just to think, like, what's the process of like this hip hop legend so established at the time to have Busta Rhymes totally unknown in the studio, so much energy coming off the record to drop something. It's just the process of making music, I think, is beautiful. Anyway, we can talk about this all day. I know you don't have all day. You're a very busy person doing many different fantastic things in this country and all around the world. Claudia De La Cruz, co-executive director of the People's Forum. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Ooh, I love that we ended on something fun, because usually we talk about the horrible things happening in the world. So it's like nice to have this like celebration of like an important anniversary that gives us an opportunity to nostalgically reminisce about things that everybody should be, if you like don't know anything that was just said, or like haven't delved into this sort of hip hop, or just like in general are very young. So I think a lot of people don't know. A lot of people only know hip hop as like what's on the radio. Yeah. So
which is go
to Spotify, Apple Music, whatever you use. Yeah, sure. But not like, there's not like a political context to it. Like, well, you might have seen in the past. Not so much. Come on. I mean, Eugene, on the radio, rarely.
Listen, we're not really going to get into that, but I think for, you know, a certified Hamilton fan, you know, let me just say, I feel I'm
that is not fair. That is not fair. I also, listen, I like bad music. Everybody knows it. I don't hide it. I'm not ashamed. I listen to a Taylor Swift song here and there. Big deal.
That's okay. I mean, she's very, very famous. And I'll note that Claudia
Well,
was
she
also
did.
just on Black Power Media recently, where you can check her out talking more about all these various pieces. But yes, there's all types of great music out there and great artists in all genres. So we're not here to take anyone down a peg. But Hamilton's not one of them. But that being said, I think that's going to bring us more or less to the end of the show here today.
Yeah, this is like our thing. At the end of every show, we have to like somehow say something like either I'm not from Virginia or I listen to bad music. What's going to be next week, Eugene?
Well, listen, you're acting like I'm just making these things up. You can't say I'm from Virginia and then not even remember Waffle House. This is like, that's not real. You're opening the door. We're just walking through it.
Listen,
that's all.
We don't have a Waffle House in Northern Virginia. There is no Waffle House in Northern
We're going to
Virginia.
look that up. But even if it's so, then it shows it's not really the South and it's not really Virginia. So my case in point.
Okay, Sarah Palin. It's not the real Virginia.
You know what the difference is between a pit bull and a hockey mom? Lipstick. It was a good line. Either way, Sarah Palin, wherever you are, hopefully, I don't know what I'm hoping for you. Anyway, long story short, thanks to all our guests. Thanks to all the people who are viewing us right now and have been. Thanks to all our patrons, especially. Make sure if you're not a patron, you go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. Help us get over 1,000. We only need a couple more. Wouldn't that be cool if you were the 1,000th person? Yes, it would be cool. So go ahead and do it at patreon.com/breakthrough news. Shout out to everyone also who donated here in the YouTube system, I guess whatever we want to call it, this evening. Also very grateful to you. Really appreciate one-time donations, recurring donations, any donation, and all your support. But for myself, for Rania, for our entire Breakthrough News team, that'll bring it to a close, and we will see you next time.